morning, everyone. We will now begin with our webinar series, and we warmly welcome everyone to our first technical webinar series for 2020. Dear participants, as we all know, behavioral research seeks to understand the predictable but often counterintuitive ways in which people make decisions, how they form intentions, and whether they follow through with them. By seeking to understand how personal, social, and environmental factors shape human behavior, behavior research helps us to reveal why individuals do not always act as one would expect or as they themselves intended to, and sometimes not even in the way that might be best for their welfare. So warm greetings to all participants that are logged on this morning. Welcome to the Consumer Empowerment and Market Conduct Working Group Technical Webinar Series, our first for 2020, on customer-centric approach and behavioral insights for consumer protection. So my name is Eliki Boletawa. I'm the head of policy programs and regional initiatives for AFI, and it is my pleasure to be your moderator for today's webinar. Now, the challenges arising from the spread of the COVID-19 have resulted in the accelerated use of virtual technologies and tools, as many have gone into lockdown modes, millions are forced to work from home, and digital connectivity has taken even more of a hold on our everyday behavior. Within the AFI Management Unit, we have implemented our business continuity plan, which includes virtual meetings and webinars, and this is the first of our series of working group technical webinars, and we are pleased to introduce our technical experts for today. But running very quickly through our agenda, following my introduction, we will go straight into the first part, which would be focusing on behavioral economics and consumer protection, and then the second part, which would look at client feedback and consumer protection, followed by our Q&A session, and then we will conclude. So our first panelist for today, our technical expert, is Ms. Isabelle Barrès. She is the Vice President at the Center for Financial Inclusion, where she leads global efforts to protect and empower vulnerable financial consumers. She has over 25 years of experience in banking and financial inclusion. She has devoted her career to spearheading innovative solutions that increase access to quality financial services and contribute to improving people's lives. So prior to joining Accion, she developed, grew, and managed the Kiva's pioneer peer-to-peer lending platforms, funding, and client impact operations. She also led the Mix in its startup phase and its strategic initiatives in its early days. Ms. Barrès has been a key contributor to best practice publications on sustainability standards and consumer protection. She holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Montreal, an MBA from McGill University, and a postgraduate degree in development economics from Sorbonne. So welcome, Isabelle. Our second technical expert is Mr. Eric Noggle. He's the Senior Director of Research at the Center for Financial Inclusion at Accion, where he leads a team of researchers who study financial capability, financial health, digital financial services, and innovations in the sector. Prior to joining Accion, Eric served as a research director at Microfinance Opportunities, where he led a dozen financial diaries studies which examined a diverse set of topics, including pay-as-you-go energy services, savings groups, and the economic condition of government workers. He also worked with banks, impact investors, and mobile operators to assess the impact of their policies, products, and services on customers. Eric holds a Master of Public Administration from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University and a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Political Science from the University of Nevada. On that note, I would like to now invite Eric for his first session of presentation. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Eliki. I appreciate that introduction. So Salita, if you could just go ahead and straight to the next slide, please. So what I want to do is start out with a quick introduction about behavioral economics and their role in financial services, as well as a little bit of the work that we've done at the Center for Financial Inclusion. So under traditional economic theory, people are rational and they make rational decisions. This has been the idea that had governed economics and how we think about decision-making models for decades. Several years ago, Dr. Richard Thaler at the University of Chicago started thinking about these situations in which people were making choices that weren't explained by this traditional theory. In other words, he started thinking about situations in which people were making irrational decisions. And so he started studying how to change the context in which decisions were made to be more in line with theory. In other words, how can we make decisions more rational? And that led to the development of behavioral economics as a discipline. And so broadly, it's the study of people's decision making, its determinants, and how we change the context of those decision making situations to shift behavior. And Dr. Taylor received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2017 for this work. So that's really what got this discipline going. Next slide, please. So within financial services, behavioral economics has predominantly been applied to figure out how do we boost usage of financial products. And there's been a lot of academic work to understand the answer to that question. So I2I out of South Africa has a great review of hundreds of studies that look at different cognitive biases and behavioral economics, interventions based on the two and the outputs of those. I assume these slides will get circulated, and so I've created a hyperlink for that so you can go look at that resource. And both academic and private firms are advising everyone from private institutions and fintechs to governments on how to embed behavioral insights into financial products to boost use, and depending on the objective of the client, how to improve client well-being. And so these are a couple of sort of big names in that space. Common Sense Lab at Duke University in the United States. The Behavioral Insights team is based out of the UK, and then Ideas 42 is another private firm that does this work. At the Center for Financial Inclusion, we've been talking about behavioral economics and insights for a while, especially looking at the intersection with it and more traditional financial capability or education approaches, and how those two things play together to improve consumer financial health. And so we've done several reports, we've done some blogs. These are just some screen grabs of some of the work that we've done. And we're trying now to really apply what we've learned to a practical application. And so on the next slide here, these are screenshots from an application that we're developing called FinVenture, and it's intended to track and improve users' financial well-being over time. And we rely on identifying cognitive biases and then applying behavioral economics approaches and those lessons, as well as traditional financial capability approaches to push the well-being of our users. And so if we jump to the next slide here. So there are dozens of cognitive biases. So these are cards, or flip cards or flashcards that have been produced by Common Sense Lab that give an overview of a lot of the different cognitive biases that we run into when we think about people's behavior. And what I've laid out here is just an example of the types of cognitive biases that we target, both to help boost engagement with the application, which is sort of boosting that use piece, as well as using behavioral principles to actually boost progress towards outcomes. So for instance, we've gamified the application to make it more fun for people to play and engage with, but we use a lot of sort of goal setting and planning cognitive biases and behavioral nudges to help boost progress towards financial outcomes, excuse me. So that's some of the work that we're doing at CFI. Now I want to sort of take a shift and look a little bit more at the market level here. So if we jump to the next slide. So CGAP about 5 years ago did some work on behavioral economics when it was getting very trendy, and took a look at what was the relationship between behavioral economics and consumer protection. And the reason why they said that this was important at a market level was that the idea behind behavioral economics is that you're trying to find sort of that least common denominator behavior that you can change across many different people. And so by focusing on common traits and patterns, finding that element that you can focus on at a market level, you can change the behavior of lots of people at a very low cost, which for consumer protection is obviously relevant. The second reason why it was important, especially in an emerging market context, was that consumers, especially low-income consumers, face more precarious economic circumstances. And so the consequences of a bad decision or a bad actor can be much more severe. And behavioral economics, especially at the time they looked at it, was providing research that maybe there were ways that we could push people away from those bad decisions or those bad actors. Go to the next slide. Great, thank you. So why, again, digging into this question about why is behavioral economics relevant for consumer protection? So behavioral economics is again, really about how do we take in information and then respond to it. That's very similar to one of the goals of consumer protection, which is to govern information flows, but in this case, between firms and consumers, and to make sure that the information that flows back and forth between those two entities results in what we call welfare increasing trades. Consumers process the information that they receive in one of two ways. There's the central route, and this is the route that I think most of us would like to believe we sit in, which is basically we're making an educated decision. We've had the time to think about the problem, we're motivated to think about the problem, we've looked at the message, the subject, the context, and we make a decision based on that. There's also this sort of peripheral or indirect route where we don't have tons of attention as individuals. We don't know the information as well as we need to. And so we make a decision that is based more on impressions or moods or our relationship with the person or organization we're getting the information from. What's interesting about behavioral economics is that regardless of which one of those paths a consumer is making the decision with, there have been a lot of studies that show we can nudge behavior in both circumstances. So in terms of governing this information flow between firms and consumers, behavioral economics, we know, can work down both of these pathways. But there's this question about whether they should. So if we jump to the next slide, there's this sort of outstanding question about whether behavioral economics is the right tool for policymakers, despite the fact that we know that it can work and that it does solve a problem. And part of the issue here is that there are this is a very young discipline. And so we're making the presumption a lot of the time that the decisions that people are making are irrational. But what more research is showing is that people are making rational responses to things like poorly designed disclosures, or they're rational in a very particular context. And so a good example of this, and this comes from the United States, is payday loans. These very high interest loans that people tend to get in an emergency. The idea is that these loans are bad, that they're expensive, that people won't be able to repay. But there are surveys that suggest the opposite, that the clients of these products actually have a very good understanding of what the product is, what the interest rate means for them, can anticipate their ability to repay fairly well, and that they're going to this service because they're in this sort of emergency scenario. So from the outside, it looks like maybe this isn't a rational choice, going for a very expensive financial product where there's a lot of risk. But from the perspective of the client, this is a very rational decision given the context they're in. The second issue, or the second question about whether behavioral economics is the right tool for policymakers, is the issue that the framing that is used in behavioral economics is really critical in terms of determining the outcome that you're going to get from the intervention. And so there's been a lot of interesting work done lately out of the US Federal Reserve on this question. And so the principal economist there at a conference at the CFPB, which is one of our regulators, noted recently that the evidence supporting cognitive biases and how we respond to cognitive biases is very sensitive to format, content, and context, which means that the outcome that you get can change a lot based on how you are presenting information. So when problems are framed differently, the results that we get both in academic and practical settings can contradict each other over time. And so that leads to this question about whether behavioral economics is the right tool, because fundamentally you have to make a normative judgment about where you are pushing behavior with behavior economics. You are instituting a nudge to encourage a behavior in one direction or another. And so there is some concern, especially in democracies or free market systems, that that isn't necessarily the role of the policymaker. And what's especially concerning potentially is that a behavioral approach, there's been some research that's shown that it might actually reduce welfare on the whole to take a behavioral approach to a policy question. So if we go to the last slide here, this is a little bit of an example that goes into this in a little bit more detail, which is, the question here was about defaults. So there's a lot of good research about how defaults work for improving things like savings behavior and retirement accounts. We don't know as much about why defaults work. And so what these researchers who were based out of Stanford did a survey of retirement accounts of formal employees within the US federal government. And they compared the determinants of savings behavior for people who opted in to the enrollment program, so people who had to check the box to join, versus just auto-enrolling everyone in the program. And they examined things like whether people were present-focused or future-focused, what the level of financial literacy was, and a variety of other determinants. The upshot of what they found was that the determinants of how much people saved changed based on those two regimes. And what I mean by, to sort of put it in other words here, was that if in the situation where people were auto-enrolled, that benefited people with lower financial literacy. In other words, the outcomes for them were comparatively better than for people who were more financially literate, as composed to the opt-in regime, where people who were more financially literate did better than the people who were less financially literate. And the implication of that, in just this simple example, is that the choice of this opt-in versus auto-enrollment decision had heterogeneous welfare impacts across subgroups. So even though it seemed like a pretty basic change, it didn't affect everybody equally. And what the researchers found even further was that there were all these subtle changes that even changed those outcomes. So how people reacted when the default contribution was set to 0, 3, or 5% shifted how important things like financial literacy or present bias was. So they found a lot of nuance in the study about how these behavioral approaches changed behavior. So if we jump to the last slide here, in this section, the upshot that I want to communicate here is that we know behavioral approaches are very good at shifting behavior. You could undoubtedly, as a regulator or a policymaker, design a behaviorally informed intervention that changed consumer outcomes. But this is a really young field, and interventions need to be carefully considered because there are a lot of unknowns in designing these sorts of projects. So just a handful of basic questions here to ask yourself before you embark on a behavioral approach, which is, are you clear about the problem that you're trying to solve? Do you have a very clear target that you're aiming at? Do you understand how consumers are making the decision within the status quo? And this sort of goes to the payday loan example, for instance, that, if a very expensive loan is the only loan that people can access, then accessing it isn't irrational if people are in an emergency. And so you have to really understand the context in which people are making decisions before you can start creating interventions to nudge those decisions in a normative way. You need to make sure that you have the opportunity to test the efficacy of your approach and then assess the welfare benefits from that approach, because otherwise you'll run into a situation where you might increase welfare in one group but decrease welfare in another group, and you have to have clarity about whether that's a decision that you can make from your position as a regulator. And then the last thing I would mention is that behavioral nudges don't happen in a vacuum, and this is especially true at sort of a policy level, which is if you create a situation or a mandate that uses behavioral nudge, can you manage the externalities that would result from that? So can providers respond to your situation or to your intervention in such a way that it makes it less effective over time? And how do you iterate on that going forward? So with that, I'll stop. I know, I think at least one question has come through. Eliki, I don't know if we'll turn it back to you to to manage that, or if you'd like me to turn it over to Isabelle now.
Maybe we turn over to Isabelle for now. Because of the numbers we have, we can allow the participants to ask questions live. Yeah,
sure.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about this topic. This is a topic that I am particularly passionate about. At the Smart Campaign at CFI, we have started doing some research on the client voice a few years ago. When you consider the history of our work in consumer protection that dates back 10 years, it's still relatively recent, even though it's already been a few years. But I think it's a really great opportunity to make sure incorporating the client voice is a really great opportunity to make sure that as we think of what risks are more important to prioritize, and as we think of mitigation strategies to address these risks, we really make sure that they're grounded in the reality of the clients. So not making too many assumptions about what we think is important from the client's perspective, or also as we design solutions, just making sure that we have an opportunity to test these solutions. So I think it's a very important dimension to add. So to date, we also feel that there have been relatively few efforts that have been done for this pillar of client protection, either by us or by the sector also at large. Sorry, if you could go to the next slide. So where we started in 2016, we did client voice level research in 4 countries, in Benin, Pakistan, Peru, and Georgia. And through that process, what we did, and we refer to this as client voice 1.0, so to speak. So we talked to, we talked to thousands of clients and really try to get their perspective on their experiences. And some of the biggest learnings that we got from this first set of client voice research is summarized in 5 key learnings. So one, what we learned is that even though there are a lot of similarities in terms of the client experiences as it relates to consumer protection, that there were very different issues depending on the level of maturity of the market. So mainly kind of a focus or preoccupation on transparency versus fraud. So that was insightful and interesting just to note, given that when we think of consumer protection, there is often a very long list of issues, and that this question of prioritizing is really key. The second learning from this preliminary research that we did was the need for authentic transparency. And what we mean by that, by authentic transparency, it's really going beyond the notion of disclosing, not only disclosing all information to the clients and at the right time, but making sure that clients really understand the information that they're presented with so that they can make informed decisions. So transparency really going beyond the concept of just making the information available. The third biggest learning was shaming of clients. So shaming of clients causes lasting pain and suffering, but what was interesting there is that the incidence of was relatively low. It was a relatively rare case, but it really had ripple effects in terms of affecting the reputation of the institution, and so also very, very important. And so what came through that particular finding was also the notion that not all risks are created equal, and maybe that goes without saying, but again, when we think of the long kind of list of client protection issues to focus on, it's also important to keep that in mind and in the prioritization. Credit bureaus, important but often misunderstood, which is also an important point we'll come back on with the example from Peru. And last but not least, the clients don't know about or don't believe in recourse mechanisms. And recourse mechanisms we feel are really critical because they're a way to keep a pulse on the markets, also to see what's really happening on the ground, and to again have those feedback mechanisms between the clients and the institution, so that we can hear what the client concerns are. So it's very important to have good recourse mechanisms in place. Next slide, please. So some findings from Peru. So when designing the consumer protection regulation, regulators often work with imperfect information about risks to consumers. And in the case of Peru, the Superintendency in Banking, Insurance and Private Pension Fund, SBS, worked with us to improve the regulatory environment. And there were three main findings. So the first finding was that the clients didn't understand how credit bureaus work or the consequences of having a negative credit record. That was a surprise for the Superintendencia, and three steps that they were able to put in place as a response after this finding was launching a media campaign and training on credit history, mandating non-payment warning to be included in term sheets, and also creating simple and accessible credit reports. So really some practical solutions. The second finding was that 40% of clients didn't understand the loan terms, and many expressed confusion with loan insurance and what the loan insurance covered. So what SBS did as a response was to experiment with simplified client-centric summaries that enable them to provide clear information, while also requiring that marketing of insurance include the scope and the characteristics of the product coverage. And the third finding for the case of Peru was that 26% of clients reported that providers did not treat them equally, and that they were discriminating against those of lower socioeconomic status. So CBS's response to that was to make changes to laws on market conduct and incorporated detailed responsibilities for financial institutions to improve their business practices. So from those promising findings that really translated into some concrete actions on the part of the regulator, we were excited to replicate the work in the context of Rwanda, and we really hope that and aspire that the findings can spark similar responses as well. Next slide. So what did we do in the case of Rwanda? So two things. One, and I'll talk a little bit about the research methodology, but we combined data and stories. We felt it was really important to have a combination of quantitative and qualitative analysis. What was different in the case of Rwanda was also a shift to digital financial services. So the main research question that the study aimed to answer was to understand the client's views about their interaction with digital financial services industry and the various types of providers that they were interacting with. Second, we were also, so secondary objectives were looking at understanding if and how consumers had negative interactions with the digital financial service industry, and also understand how those experiences impacted them. And finally, also, we were interested in understanding better what were the most important stories. So this speaks to the stories and the qualitative aspect of the research, but what were the most important stories and what were the negative experiences in dealing with the digital financial service providers, and also how common were the experiences of consumer protection problems within digital financial services. So in the case of Rwanda, we ran a quantitative survey of a little over 1,200 respondents in various districts. And we also did 25 semi-structured interviews to dig deeper on some of the issues with clients and also with agents. Next slide, please. And we also had, a National Advisory Council that was made of a number of representatives in the industry, from the National Bank of Rwanda, from the Rwanda Utilities Regulatory Authority, also from Access to Finance Rwanda, from Rwanda Consumers Organization, from AMIR, the Association of Microfinance Institutions in Rwanda, and also from the CEEP network. So having this representative group of stakeholders also was, we felt, a great asset to this study, to have the perspective of different representatives. Oh, sorry, can we go back to the satisfaction? Okay, so there were a lot of insights from the study, and here, just in the interest of time, I'm going to focus just on two key issues, and that is the attitude towards trust and also fraud. But we also had, and I encourage you to read the full report if you can. There were also some other insights in terms of disclosure and some nascent insights on mobile credits. But again, here we'll just focus on trust and fraud. So first, for trust, in the 3 districts, there were 49% of clients that reported to be satisfied and 46% to be very satisfied with mobile money. So that was, a significant portion of clients, about 95%. Also a strong majority of current users that interact with mobile money agents, so a little over 90%, reported to be very satisfied or satisfied as well. So this really high level of satisfaction provides impressive endorsement on the success and quality of mobile money services in the country. In regards to trust, so here we looked at the results also in terms of the breakdown of the different providers between the mobile money providers, the SACOs, VSLAs, and banks, and confirms again that the largest the percentage of respondents was for mobile money providers. So unpacking trust, we see that 93% of the respondents prefer cash transactions to digital. For saving using a mobile money wallet or digital savings account was less popular than a traditional savings institution, such as a SACO or informal savings group. And a majority of the respondents, 53%, believe that it's easy to lose money stored on mobile phones, and a little less than 30% believe that losing one phone would mean losing money stored on the mobile account. So that was also interesting to see the difference in the product, kind of the experience between the different types of products. So fraud, moving to fraud. Fraud was a big issue. Fraud is not unique to mobile money, but as compared to microfinance, and we can see that, for example, from the results of our research in Benin. In Benin, we saw that one of the big issues was fake microfinance institutions. That was a big problem in Benin. And here, there are new dynamics that are at play. So some of the dynamics are less face-to-face interaction between the clients and the providers, also less interactions between the provider agents and management, a greater onus on the clients to conduct transactions unassisted or with less assistance, and a wider network of entry points from fraudsters, scammers to gain access to client data and information. So what are some of the examples of fraud that we heard about? So there were a number of different responses there, but here just to give you a few examples. So one was around people pretending to be a friend or having a financial emergency. Another set of incidents of fraud or examples were a story that they had won a lottery or some other kind of prize or a giveaway. Another type of fraud was around false transactions, so sending money to a different number than the one that was requested, or fraudulent use of a client PIN to send or withdraw money. And last but not least, frauds around split transactions, so having conflicting information from agents, especially regarding fees when sending and receiving money, and agents abusing their power in those circumstances. So for fraud, there are several consequences of fraud, financial, emotional, and trust. Financial implication of fraud is a client who described their personal experiences of falling victim to fraud in our qualitative interviews had suffered losses that were varying from a little less than the equivalent of $4 to $85, so significant range in terms of the financial loss. Some of the consequences of fraud also were emotional. So some of the quotes from client, or one quote from client was, "You see it as it makes you sad. You think about the time you wasted and that loss that has just happened to you. If you were sending the money to pay for something, it's a waste." So a lot of emotional consequences also. And last but not least, the trust consequence of fraud. Clients who have experienced fraud have a lower trust in mobile money. The difference was significant, 15 percentage points difference, and also a lower trust in mobile money agents, an even bigger difference, 37% percentage point difference between the clients who had experienced fraud and the clients who had not experienced fraud. The recourse from fraud. So the most common course of action for clients who had been overcharged or suspected an agent of overcharging them was just to stop using that agent. And of course, that strategy is only possible for clients who have the choice of agents or the time also to pursue multiple agents in order to compare the charges. For over half of the mobile money users, that wasn't really an option, as the nearest agent is more than 10-minute walking distance from their home and more than 30 minutes for 20% of the mobile money users. So complaints resolution, again, I highlighted this before, but I think that's really a crucial element of any consumer protection regime, is having a really solid complaints management process in place to be able to keep tab of what's happening at the level of the clients. And here, so the results from the report were that there were about 88%, so a little less than 90% of past and current clients who reported being confident complaining about mobile money services if they needed to. So that is really encouraging. And also we found that mobile money agents play a key role in understanding the recourse mechanisms, that clients who regularly interacted with agents were more likely to have information on client recourse mechanisms, and the types of agent engagement included taking time to answer clients' questions, telling clients where to complain, updating clients on changes in terms and conditions, on pricing, of codes of conduct, etc. And clients who understood mobile money fees, terms and conditions, and the liabilities upon registration of their account were also more likely to understand where to complain in case of issues. So again, I'll stop there. We don't really have time to go into the other results of the research, but just to highlight that this type of research, the client level, is really key. That this is a quote coming from the BNR circular, the Central Bank of Rwanda, Banque Nationale du Rwanda, that trust is the single most important ingredient for growth of financial service business, and that building strength and trust is very important. And one way to do that is to strengthen the relationship with the clients and to really try to have a foot in the ground and continue to do more of this type of research that can lead to really meaningful and powerful insights for informing consumer protection policies. So I will stop here, make sure we have a few minutes for questions. Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much, Isabelle and Eric, for your presentations this morning. So we have questions that are ready from our participants. So maybe I will, because that we have time and also the number of participants, I'll allow them to ask the questions directly. And the participants, please, if you are ready for a question to pose to the panelists, please raise your hand. And when asking the questions, you can either direct it to either Isabelle or Eric, or just go directly. Yeah. Okay. So we have Reserve Bank of Fiji. Please go ahead and identify yourself, please, first.
Points, but something that we're currently working on. We're drafting our market conduct policy, and the behavioral economics discussion at the beginning of the session kind of piqued our interest, because we're now wondering whether the policy should regulate financial institution behavior, or should it be drafted in a way to also regulate consumer behavior, and whether it should be balanced or whether we should do either or. I'm wondering what your thoughts are, especially on Eric.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a first stab at this. I mean, Isabelle is really the expert on market conduct policies. I mean, my initial reaction is to say that you probably, what you really need to understand is the outcomes that your regulation on providers are resulting in. So without knowing more about your specific situation, I don't know if that's a useful response, but if the question is about regulating sort of client behavior versus financial institution behavior, I think really, the easier pathway is probably to regulate institutional behavior, but be able to track client outcomes to some degree. But Isabelle, I welcome your assist.
I think that's a good answer, and I wonder if you could just expand a little bit more what you mean by regulating the consumer behavior.
Well, when we do a very rough root cause analysis, apart from the fact that we don't have legislation, market conduct related legislation, we have a lot of prudential guidelines and requirements, but none alone market conduct for licensed financial institutions. When we do root cause analysis of other complaints we get, we find that apart from behavior of the financial institutions, consumers also don't read contracts, or they don't understand it, or they make what we think are irrational decisions on loans and the type of interest rates that they accept. And so we're wondering whether regulation, how far should our regulation go so that in a way we're forcing consumer behavioral changes also? I don't know, does that answer your question?
No, that's really helpful. I mean, I think one of the things that I think some of the studies in that I2I compendium would help. I think the thing that is very difficult in the situation that you're facing is if a consumer doesn't understand a contract, is it because the contract is poorly designed, or is it because of a lack of capability in the client? And that's a very difficult question.
Yeah, that was going to be my line of answer also, is focusing maybe one useful way to approach this is to focus on building the capability of the client. But to expand on what Eric was saying, you could also have a well-informed and capable client who is not responsible, and where in that case there is also some responsibility you know, on behalf of the client. And one parallel maybe that I can bring to this to think about more is in the example of credit cards in the US, for example, where the client is not liable if there's, you know, the credit card gets lost or stolen, but that is within the limits of the client does have the responsibility to call the bank as soon as he or she realizes the loss, and if the client does not do that, then there are limitations also to the recourse. So yeah, I think it's definitely an area that's worth exploring more, because it's complex.
Thank you very much, Eric and Isabelle, for their very nice presentation. I have just two questions, one for Eric and one for Isabelle. The first one for Eric is about payday survey. When you see that while rationally the payday loans looks like an attractive option, respondents say it's differently. But don't you think that it's maybe a flaw in the survey itself? I mean that the respondents, when they answered the questions, they answered it irrational. Just, I mean, overestimating that time for getting loan is much valuable than the money that they need to pay to repay. And the next question will be to Isabelle. It's about frauds. Do you think there's any opportunity to use behavioral economics solutions to prevent frauds? Because many of the frauds, especially that you just presented, they're based on social communication techniques. And in this case, behavioral solutions can be quite valuable to prevent this kind of fraud. Thank you very much.
Thanks for those questions. So I'll answer your first one quickly here. So the survey in that case was actually very straightforward. It's a pretty simple design. It's something only like 10 questions. And the questions are fairly straightforward. I think one of the, you know, getting back to this question of how do we understand the context in which the decisions are being made, one of the things that I think was interesting about that survey was that the number one reason people were taking out payday loans was to meet their everyday expenses. And why I think that's interesting is because we've seen, and I've seen a lot of this in my research, where we've seen similar patterns internationally, and largely what is happening in those situations is that a low-income household, you know, and I've seen it, for instance, I've done this with garment workers in Bangladesh, but a low-income household will take a high-interest short-term loan, knowing that they're going to get paid in 2 weeks' time, and so they'll take on the debt, meet their household expenses. They'll get paid, and they'll use a portion of the payment they receive to pay off the debt. So they've anticipated it well, and then we'll use another portion of their income to meet their expenses over the next week or 2 weeks. But because they're behind on their expenses, because they're sort of in this debt cycle, they're forced to keep going back to these short-term loans, which tend to be more high interest. And they do that because they don't have the economic opportunity to boost their income. They can't cut back their expenditures because their expenditures are already pretty low, or they don't have the access to the right financial tools to be able to get them out of that debt trap. So, you know, if that's the context in which the decision is made, it makes a lot of sense, and we see that pattern internationally. But I'm happy to send you the link to the survey as well, so you can take a look for yourself. But you know, again, it just goes back to understanding the context of why people are making the decisions that they're doing. So I don't know if that answers your question, or if not, I'm happy to dig into it a little bit more. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Isabelle.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity to exploit or explore kind of further how behavioral science can help address fraud issues. Maybe I can give you a little bit more examples of the types of frauds that were found in the context of the research for Rwanda. So some of the scams some examples of the scams were starting with a phone call where the victims were told that they would receive a certain amount of money and that they would need to send the sum to another number, either to confirm the winnings or also to help with a financial emergency. And then at that point, the fake SMS was received by the victims confirming that the money had reached their account. And these SMS resemble closely the real confirmation that the SMS sent from providers. So anyway, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to do further research and try to understand better kind of what is the closer interplay between behavioral research and addressing some of the most pressing consumer protection issues like fraud.
All right, great. There is another question from RBF. You can proceed with the question.
Thank you, Eliki, and thank you to Eric and Isabelle for the presentation. Just have an additional questions on the other forms of interventions that you both think a regulator can put in place or develop to better protect consumers against some of the innocent mistakes that they can make, resulting from probably misinformation or having to be forced to make complex financial decisions, and also from their own behavioral biases. Your thoughts on what can the regulator put in place, if there's any?
Isabelle probably has more experience from which to answer this question than I do. I mean, I think that there are a few things that we see come out of a lot of the consumer, behavioral research that we do about, everything ranging from changing how terms are displayed to users before they get a loan, for instance. The expectation that, especially in low literacy environments, that people can read a 10, 20, 30 page document and understand the terms is very difficult. So just how is information structured? What are the key critical pieces of information that people need? How can those be displayed in such a way that they are accessible to people at various levels of sophistication? There's been a lot of sort of behavioral and non-behavioral work around sort of designing those sorts of disclosures that I think could be really effective. There are other things that we've seen in terms of either waiting periods or consumers really like having we call it sort of forgiving design especially when we talk about it in products, but is there an escape or an exit for them that they can take without enduring a lot of harm? That seems to be a feature that people sort of really like at least within the product space. I'm not sure exactly how that would get adapted to the regulatory environment, but I think there are a lot of things in terms of recourse mechanisms that would probably align with that well. Isabelle, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
So thank you, Eric. Does that answer your question, RBF?
Yes, it does somewhat. Just a follow up on that. Where do we then draw the balance between institutions trying to cover themselves legally, especially when you're talking about certain things like loan contracts, and balancing covering them legally and putting things out to the consumer as simply as possible? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it gets a little bit into my response will probably sound a little academic, but it gets back to this idea of what's going to be the level of information that the firm needs to share to the consumer to ensure this sort of welfare increasing trade idea. And so, we know, for instance, that most consumers do not read the disclosures or every word of the disclosures that they get. It's just too difficult to do. And so if we know that that's true, the presumption that we have to make is that we could offer a simplified set of disclosures that would provide more information to the consumer than what they're getting right now. And that's, I think part of getting into the, sort of understanding what are the probabilities, I think you mentioned looking at your recourse mechanisms and knowing sort of the sources of complaints, that you can do some modeling to figure out what are the most common reasons or what are the most common issues that consumers are having, and how do we highlight those in a disclosure so that the question isn't about necessarily having a fully informed consumer, a consumer that knows every single detail of the contract that they're signing, but they're signing the things that are most likely to do, paying attention to the things that are most likely to do them harm. I mean, there's always going to be a tension between those two sides. That's I think part of the fun of your job is managing that tension. But I think, there are both some theory and sort of quantitative approaches that you could take to trying to understand better, what are the critical pieces of information that you need to get to a consumer to make sure that we're having sort of those welfare increasing trades happen.
Hi, this is Isabelle. I'm sorry I missed the beginning of the question, but just to follow up a little bit on that, I'd say that actually I would be more extreme than this, or more provocative, and say that information that is in a contract should be understandable by the client. And we really need to shift the balance towards the consumer. Like, there is no reason to have in a contract information that is, so complex or non-digestible that it can't be relevant for the client. And I know it's a big challenge. I know it's a big shift. But in addition to the approach that Eric mentioned of having kind of a key facts document that highlights the key terms and conditions of the individual products, even the longer form should contain information that is explained in a way that is really digestible. So there may be still the question of length and depth, where there is value on having a summarized format. But again, I'd say that even in the longer formats, we really need to fix disclosure. Disclosure is still broken, and I think that's relevant for every country around the world, including developed economies. Like, really just finding new and better ways to convey information that is relevant to clients, and to break this imbalance that still exists between providers and consumers.
So the first question goes to Eric. Eric, this is a question from Moses Musanto from the Bank of Zambia. So the question goes, what advice will you give to policymakers or regulators that are seeking to develop improved behaviorally informed disclosure policies?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I would echo back to some of the questions I posed at the end of the presentation, where I think the critical thing is to really test the intervention that you're trying. So there have been a lot of studies showing how changes in format and the information that you're disclosing changes behavior. There's not a hard fast rule on that. And so you really have to take the time to test what the impact of your change is going to be before you roll it out. I think that would be my #1 piece of advice is don't roll it out blindly. Try it in a variety of different contexts with across a variety of different customer segments to make sure that you are getting results that are, if they're not consistent, are at least within a bound that you find acceptable as a regulator.
Okay, thank you for that response, Eric. So there's another question for you. So the question goes, has there been any research performed regarding bundling, that is opt-out mechanism, of financial services, example, micro-insurance bundled to other financial products like savings, and if there is any specific focus on consumer protection?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question too. I know that there have been some studies that have looked at what happens when you provide an insurance product with a credit product, for instance. I'm less familiar with any studies that look at the intersection between either of those things and people's ability to opt out and consumer protection specifically.
Okay, great. And then there's another question here from Elizabeth Guerrero from Paraguay. In the case of frauds in which customers have provided their data because they felt cheated, could they have been covered by a fraud policy? I think this is for Isabelle.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Okay, this is being posed in Spanish. I'll try. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, let me put on. Okay. Elizabeth?
Hola.
Hola, Elizabeth.
¿Cómo están? Buenos días. Creo que no llegó todo mi texto. Sí, quería saber si esos consumidores han sido resarcidos o tienen la posibilidad de acceder a los beneficios de alguna póliza de seguro. Por eso especifiqué que en los casos en que hayan proveído sus datos, porque a veces en esas situaciones como que se lleva un poco la culpa al consumidor, aunque haya sido engañado, lógicamente. Quería saber cómo se resolvieron esos casos.
Thank you for your question. So I think I understood. So I don't have any. Oh, I don't know, Eliki, did you want to translate it back into English for the participants?
Sorry.
Anyway.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so around the question of when clients have submitted their own data, so when clients also have some responsibility, I guess, in the fraud, or you could argue that clients have responsibility, then what can be done, or what are some examples of ways in which they can be protected? I don't have any specific examples at hand, but I do think you're highlighting an important challenge that comes to play in terms of identifying where the responsibility lies. I think that for a number of consumer protection issues, but especially maybe with fraud, it's important to understand what is the kind of to segment and understand what is the responsibilities of the different parties, including the client, and also to see what can be done to increase the responsibility, because there are some limitations to what financial providers can do. And we certainly want to make sure that financial service providers are doing everything that they can to protect clients, but you know, if to the extent that they are doing what is in their ability to raise awareness around the risks and have clear recommendation and guidance for clients, and highlighting also what they ought to do, then fraud can still happen if the clients also don't take their responsibility. So I think that's a whole area of kind of sub area of work that needs to be deepened.
Okay, thank you, Isabelle, for that response. I think the translators are translating at the back end, so that should be good for the interpretation. So there's another question here from Flavio Pinto. So the question is, Informality is a key obstacle for regulators. How to change the behavior of customers regarding risks and providers of these illegal services. So I think it's the informal services is a key obstacle for regulators.
Sure, yeah, that's a tricky circumstance, because behavioral interventions rely on your ability to change the context, and the informal market is one place in which you start seeing the limit of what behavioral economics can do, because you have to have a pathway or a mechanism to get in between that decision-making process between the customer and the provider. And so if you can't do that because the market is informal, behavioral economics start having, it starts getting a little bit trickier. And so if you look at a lot of the research on behavioral economics, it tends to be in typically more formalized environments. And so this is where we sort of get to our work around what are the limits of behavioral economics, when are more traditional financial capability approaches still valuable. There are some activities that are going on that I think could be relevant or interesting to that environment. So we heard from a colleague from Zambia earlier. I know that Financial Sector Deepening Zambia has been working on a financial capability or financial education program that can get delivered to basic feature phones. You don't even have to have a smartphone, and based on some informal conversations, I think those have had good results. And so that's a mechanism by which you could go through sort of the financial capability pathway of influencing behavior, and you could do that at a large scale with an informal market, because it's just going to be harder to influence informal providers with a behavioral approach.
Okay, thank you for that response, Eric, and I hope, Flavio, that answers your question. The next question is in Spanish, but we've tried to translate it. So the question goes, given that trust is essential for digital financial services, what is the best way to achieve this trust? Or how to go about achieving this trust? I think anyone can answer that.
Yeah, I think that's a whole area of work that is also getting more attention. The University of South North Wales has just issued a grand challenge on trust that is headed by Catherine Kemp. I think we're going to see a lot more research and framing around that exact question of how do you get that to happen? Because I think with trust, there's answering that question requires understanding better what motivates clients, and with that comes additional risks also to manipulate that trust. So I think one direction that this line of thinking is looking into is how to also build trustworthy institutions. Because in some cases, when clients don't trust institutions, it's actually good that they don't trust institutions, because institutions are not trustworthy. So we also don't want to create a situation where clients become more trusting of institutions that don't deserve it. So I don't have an answer. I don't have a very clear answer to your question, but I think, again, you're highlighting a topic that is going to get more and more attention in the near future.
Okay, thank you for your response, Isabelle. I see a hand raise. I'll come to you very soon, hand raise. So there's a question here from Damola from the Central Bank of Nigeria. How can regulators leverage on the issue of framing to drive the actions of financial services providers?
So I can provide some thoughts here from the behavioral lens, and then Isabelle, I imagine that you'll probably also have some input. So I think again, we know that disclosures and how disclosures are framed to customers right now often are way too complicated. And so you don't even need to get to a behavioral approach necessarily to simplify the language, and simplifying the language will have an impact on how providers have to frame up the information they're sharing and potentially frame up their services. There's an entire sort of next step there that gets into the behavioral area, which is this idea that what you really need is customers who are informed enough to make the right decision, which is different than having a customer being fully informed of every potential risk. And so there's a lot of stuff that can be done in terms of what are the outcomes that you're seeing as a regulator? Where are you seeing complaints? How do you build disclosure policies that focus on those high risk areas? How do you ensure that financial institutions are engaging in and doing disclosures that help reduce those complaint areas? And then you get sort of a nice feedback loop where you can use data to see whether your framing has changed the complaints and whether the complaints has changed, lack of complaints has actually improved consumer welfare, and you use that to sort of go back and iterate the process again to influence providers. Isabelle, I don't know if you want to jump in there.
Right. So thank you, Eric. So the next question is from Golda from the Central Bank of the Philippines. Thank you for your lectures. May I kindly ask when, in terms of timing, is it best for regulators to assess if their behaviorally informed intervention has been effective or has nudged behavior?
Yeah, so I would take an iterative approach to this, which means that I would actually check this over time. The first time you'll want to check is when you design the information or the intervention and then test it. Right, so you want to make sure you have that testing realm at sort of a smaller scale to make sure that you're going to roll out an intervention that has has the impact that you're hoping it will, and then you'll want to do a second follow-up where you're tracking data related to the outcomes you want to see related to that nudge. And so you would want to do that, probably a couple months after you roll out an intervention. Sometimes it takes these things time to sort of diffuse throughout a market, diffuse into customer behavior and decision-making practices. So you can do that a couple months after you roll out an intervention, but it's important to use your leverage as a regulator and the data that you already collect to try to embed consumer outcome metrics that are going to tell you whether your intervention is going to keep working. I'm sure you all know better than I do that you sort of play this cat and mouse game with providers where you solve a problem, there's a new problem, you solve a problem, there's a new problem, and so you just need to make sure that you have the feedback loop after you do that initial testing and validation to make sure that you're sort of staying ahead of the curve.
Okay, thank you for the response, Eric. Next question is from Anil Paul, Bank of Papua New Guinea. When customers look for fast loan sanctions and when they select service provider on that basis, do you think cooling off period in regulation is a good option? And how can we help customers to understand the risk?
Yeah, so we recently updated the standards for digital credit, and this is an issue that came up because the fast turnaround that we are observing with digital financial services, that is also one of the characteristics when you compare them to analog products, it can be seen from the client perspective as something really positive. You have very short turnaround, you get your loan immediately, but from a client protection perspective, we've seen actually the importance of putting some buffer time so that you prevent impulse borrowing. We had seen that in some cases, spikes in borrowing at the beginning of the weekend or late at night on Saturday, linked to betting also. I think that the concept of having a cooling off period is one that is very important, and there certainly were a lot of discussions around that with digital financial service providers, also in the context of digital, where what you are selling is convenience and speed. What does that mean when you translate that into a digital context? And we came up with a compromise in terms of the guideline to say the spirit of that guidance still needs to be upheld in a context of digital financial services, even if it's maybe not as long of a cooling off period, but the concept that you want to put in measures to prevent impulse decisions from clients that they may regret in the future is one that we definitely feel is important to take into consideration for digital financial services.
Okay, thank you, Isabelle. Now, I think the next question is targeted for you. Of the 1,205 respondents who participated in the survey that you shared, how many respondents were women? And if you could kindly share, based on your findings, the gender that was most affected on issues relating to fraud and other negative consumer outcomes, and what gender-specific interventions would you recommend? Okay, then maybe I pose the next question to Eric. This is from Madagascar. So the question is, you recommended establishing a blacklist of those who have committed fraud so that customers are not victims. Which entity is in charge and how to publish it to inform the consumers?
Yeah, sorry, could you go over that again? That sounded like a question that was more specific to Isabelle's presentation. So I'm wondering if we could.
Okay, so maybe if you could answer, if you could answer this. This question is from Francois from Rwanda. How to ensure consumer protection, but also enhance customers' responsibilities. For instance, some customers consider protection as capping interest rates, running from auctioning process while they have failed to pay loans.
Yeah, I mean, that's a constant tension. One of the things that I've written about, and the title of this blog is in the slide, so you can look at it once the slide deck goes out. But it's a look at this very issue, which is that behavioral economics and the behavioral approach assumes that you're going to, there's an onus on controlling the context and not an onus on the decision-making responsibilities of the consumer. And Isabelle mentioned sort of the patriarchal ideas that sometimes come through consumer protection, and I think that's true with behavioral economics as well. I think, and this is more sort of a personal opinion, not necessarily something that's been heavily documented based on my research. I think you have to take approach of marrying a behavioral economics with a traditional financial capability approach. I think you have to do both. And I think if you can do both, you'll do a better job of creating that balance or managing that tension between provider responsibility and client capability.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andrew, for that response. I think there's another question here from Andrew, Central Bank of Nigeria. What are the risks affecting digital financial services? Maybe these are the consumer protection risks that would affect DFS.
Yeah, I'd be curious of whether. Sorry, go ahead, Isabelle.
No, sorry. Could you repeat the question? Was it a general question around what are yeah? Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. Sorry. So Isabelle, you have two questions waiting for you. One is from Zambia, and the other one is from Madagascar. So the one from Zambia is on gender. The first question I asked you. And then the second question was, you recommended establishing a blacklist of those who have committed fraud so that customers are not victims, right? So here, which entity or maybe institution that is in charge, and how to publish it to inform the consumers? And also, if you have an example on how to minimize the cost of recourse.
Oof, those are all really good questions. So for the blacklist question, the blacklist question maybe. So here this recommendation was based on some feedback from BNR, and I hear Françoise is on the line. That's great to hear, and maybe you can add to that too. But we saw that BNR regularly collects data from payment institutions on agents and agent fraud and agent termination. But that there was no blacklist. And so we thought that a blacklist could be a good shared resources between the regulators and the providers to avoid re-employing employees that had previously been terminated for fraud. And I don't remember specifically, but there may be some examples from the work that the ITU had done with the digital financial services working group a few years ago, with the extensive input from a large number of regulators also sharing their specific experiences. And I don't remember specific examples, but I think you're going to find that the answer is very contextual in terms of who is best positioned to handle this. For the first question, going back to the question on the study that we did in Rwanda and the disaggregation by gender, so I didn't recall any significant findings by gender, unfortunately. That is not the angle that we took for that study. We could go back and look at the raw data and see if there's, if you have kind of a specific angle you're interested in, but yeah, that was not really that. It was about, if I recall, about 50-50, and we looked at the breakdown more by the type of providers, to see whether there were significant differences in the responses for the mobile money channels specifically, and also in the different districts, but not so much by gender. And then if you could repeat, Eliki, the third question.
The third question is, what are the risks affecting DFS? I think this is looking at consumer protection.
Yeah, so for the risk affecting DFS, there are many, but if you think of risks affecting DFS as opposed to risks affecting non-DFS or the analog products, we feel that there are a few main trends that are leading to kind of thinking differently, that are forcing us to think differently about digital financial services than we were thinking in the case previously. So the first one is this move from human interaction to technology-based interactions, and thinking of models where you had most of the touch points where harm was likely to happen. The touch points between the institution and the clients were being handled by human beings, whether it was loan officers or and in a context of digital financial services, you're taking that human being out of the equation. Not always, it depends on the models. You do have some models that are hybrid and where you have a mix of tech and touch, but in some purely digital models, the product becomes the interface. And so that has implications for consumer protection in terms of completely changing the way we were thinking of consumer protection and putting a lot more onus on product design, product and channel design. So in our framework of consumer protection issues, kind of the one that was appropriate, the notion of having appropriate product design and delivery didn't used to be that significant compared to all of the other areas for consumer protection. We had on one hand the need for appropriate product design and delivery, on the other hand the need for transparency, the need for fair and respectful treatment of clients, and in the context of digital, a lot more becomes put on this principle of product design and delivery, because transparency can be handled by the product design itself, because recourse can be handled also by the product design itself. So that's one key implication. The other one is also the shift to decentralized sales force in models where you have more partnerships between different actors and fragmented business models where it entails the collaboration between different actors. For example, in the concept of digital credit, you could have one fintech entity that specializes on developing the algorithm and sells those services to another fintech that is in charge for getting clients and managing the client relationship. And so it's important to take that into consideration. Also, the fragmentation of the business models creates additional risks for consumers, and that if something happens, if there is a complaint, it becomes potentially more likely that things are going to fall through the cracks, and therefore also more important to have clear communication and clear lines of responsibilities between the different partners. And the concept of, maybe one last one, the concept of outsourcing the sales force refers to moving to a network of agents. So, you know, less branches, but still the need to have some touch points with clients, and with agent networks. I think there's a lot of potential, but there are also additional risks when you have institutions that are dependent on people they have less control over. And even though some of the traditional guidance around consumer protection from models where agents were being used was to hold agents accountable to the same, you know, that financial service providers are responsible for the behavior and the conduct of their agents. It's one thing when agent networks are somewhat limited and still in close proximity with the institution, but it's a completely different ballgame when agent networks are widely disseminated, when there are millions of agents, or when there are imbalances of power also between the agent network and the provider, and where the provider really doesn't really have the power to influence the agent network. And we've seen this in the context of Kenya, for example, with some digital financial service providers working with Safaricom or other big MNOs, and where they really have no leverage in nudging or the behavior of the agents.
Okay, thank you very much, Isabelle, for that response. And I have a last question here that is coming from Francois. This is for Eric. What is the out-of-court process best approach and implication of the regulator or ombudsman for effective small claims early resolution?
I'll be honest, I don't know if I have a good response to that. Isabelle, do you have any insight into that question?
I don't think we have any quick and fast response to that, but maybe we could take this offline and continue the conversation.
And also, I think, Francois, we can send you our collection of case studies catalog on alternative dispute resolutions, which you can also look to explore the various experiences of our member institutions. All right. So I think that brings us to the end of our very interactive session this time. We've quite impressively gone over by 19 minutes, but thank you so much, everyone, for your active participation and engagement, and for patiently listening to our discussion for our webinar today. We have now reached the end of our webinar, and we note that making policies and processes work for a financial consumer as they choose their financial service provider, taking on a new product, or resolving problems when things go wrong is a persistent challenge that is faced by many today. Increasingly, behavioral research is being deployed as an approach to improve consumer protection policy making. And for the AFI members, as evidence from this discipline grows, it is important that we continue to keep abreast of, and in all ways possible, use available tools and insights to develop policies that are more effective and consumer-centric in approach. On that note, thank you so much for your participation. We trust that you have found the webinar very useful. We will be sharing a survey link to capture your feedback on today's session, and we'll also share the slides with you. To our technical experts, Isabelle and Eric, thank you so much for imparting your knowledge and experience and the partnership. To our interpreters at the back end, Emmanuel and Lorraine, thank you for the French and Spanish translation. To the AFI team, Sulita, Prem, and Emilia, for the arrangement and IT support. To all the participants, please stay safe, take care of yourselves and your families, and warm greetings from Kuala Lumpur. Good night and goodbye and good morning, wherever you are. Thank you so much. Signing off from KL. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eliki, and everyone. Goodbye.